the ending of the fucking Duffy article, she says, this is where I really thought it was a joke. I really thought it was a joke article. She says, what I'd like to do is create anthologies for other school subjects, for history, for geography, for maths. I think poetry can help children deal with the other subjects on the curriculum by enabling them to see a subject in a new way. So you'd have a maths lesson and the teacher would hand out a poem about mathematics. What? Jesus Christ. I mean, it's so contemptuous of both of poetry and of mathematics. Like I was baffled by this.
The only end result that I can see of that, if that ever took place, which I'm pretty glad that I don't think it did, is that both subjects will be debased in the process.
Right. No. I mean, you couldn't come away from that experience wanting to have anything to do with either of them.
It's just I think it's such a clear example of a overreaching, good-natured, populist failure.
I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you all for listening. There are some of you are new. We had some new listeners joining lately, so welcome to you all. I'm glad to have you, and please do tell a friend. Let people know about the show if you think they might like it. I am grateful. So this week I have a big, juicy, gossipy story of British poetry controversy that was really brought to me sort of gift wrapped by our very own Cameron Clark, all the way from Oxford. So I actually got Cameron on the line to talk about it, and he did a great job sort of guiding us through this big poetry dust up from the tail end of 2011. We talk about Geoffrey Hill, we talk about Caroline Duffy, we talk about Lem Sissay, among a number of other things, including reading poetry by way of Braille. So this is a marathon conversation, but I think it's a pretty engrossing one. I hope you will enjoy it. Let's get to that right now. So this concerns some words that were exchanged at a distance between Caroline Duffy and Geoffrey Hill a little over 10 years ago. Do you want to give a brief introduction to who these people are for anybody who might not be familiar?
Yeah, of course. I don't know if I'd say exchange. Well, obviously they didn't communicate with each other, and I don't know.
Right.
I don't even know if Duffy ever acknowledged what Hill said about her. But yes, they talked about it.
He had words for her. She didn't. She never addressed him. Yeah. Geoffrey Hill was the Oxford poetry professor, and Caroline Duffy was the poet laureate of the UK, or because I know there's separate poet laureates for like Scotland and Wales.
Yeah, Scotland has makers. I want to say UK, but it may have been England. So okay. I'm not too sure on that.
But it's the big one. It's the one that Tennyson was, among other people. Uh-huh. So what is, for people who might not know, what is the difference between those offices?
Okay, so it's an interesting difference. So Professor of Poetry is a job at Oxford where they're voted in by a process of, I think, people who have, Oxford graduates, Oxford alumni, vote in sort of applicants that go up and say, I want to be the next Professor of Poetry, and the Oxford alumni vote them in. And what normally happens is, from what I've gleaned of looking over the elections, is that normally the most famous or the most prestigious or the most interesting applicant gets voted in. So right. You'll get sort of very famous poets.
Yeah, what in politics would be called like name recognition, kind of as decisive.
Yeah. And the position doesn't entail much. You have to perform, I think, I can't remember the exact number. It may be 10 or 12, around that.
I think it's 3 a year for however many years.
Yeah, 3 a year for about 4 years, I think, yeah. In line with the Oxford terms, Trinity, Michaelmas, and Hilary. The lectures can be on poetry, but apart from that, the lecturer has a vast choice. I think in recent years the lecturers have also sort of been interesting ways of doing poetry events around the city of Oxford, probably in the name of accessibility and getting a lot of poets and a lot of different styles together. But that isn't a set rule. That's just a choice they've made, and I don't
Right.
think Hill did that very characteristically of Hill.
Right. Yeah, it would be a little surprising if he had
Yeah,
supplied his own word fest to the to the festivity.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
Oh, no, yeah, when he's
yeah,
finished
which
working.
we'll get. Boy, that's
Yeah, yeah,
that's
of course.
bracing. So
Okay,
then,
so
what about the poet laureate, or what does this mean?
the poet laureate is a much more involving job. See, I always thought that as a poet laureate in England, you had to write poems for sort of major occasions, so
That
royal
I know that
weddings.
used to be the case. I don't know if it
Yeah,
has when that stopped. If
apparently
it did.
it isn't the case anymore.
Ah, okay.
Apparently they don't have to do that, but I get the feeling that they're encouraged to do that because the amount of royal poems that still come out is quite amazing, really. I Duffy wrote a lot of poems for different occasions. I think Simon Armitage, who is the new um, poet laureate currently, and who was professor of poetry after Hill,
Yeah, I'm actually
he
reading
just
his lectures right now that he gave.
yeah.
Yeah.
What are the lectures called again? I read them a few months ago.
A vertical art is what they're. Yeah,
Yeah. Mm,
yeah, yeah.
they're interesting. I don't know if I agree with them, but they're interesting. Um, yeah, so the poet laureate is a more engaging, more public role. Can I say something subjective and opinionated about
Yeah, yeah.
Oxford?
Please, please, no, please.
I, as a terrible poet, if I was ever asked to do either, I would go straight for the professor of poetry and never be a poet laureate because I think I wouldn't call it saying. I think it'd be too extreme to saying you're selling yourself out or like you're
Right,
selling yourself. But I really don't see the advantage of it beyond fame, because
right.
I think there's a sickness. There's like a term people talk about in the I've seen talked about in English media about sort of the disease of the poet laureateship, and
Yeah,
no poet once they become the poet laureate has ever written good poems. Wordsworth was the poet laureate, and we don't remember Wordsworth for any of the poems he wrote. Then he was sort of, I think he
yeah,
was quite old. Tennyson is a slight a case that the case that doesn't follow the rule that proves the rule in a way
yeah.
because we sort of realize his difference. But I mean, Karen Duffy could write some egregious poems, in my opinion, obviously. But some egregious poems if he was in the role.
Yeah.
She wrote a poem about, I forgot his first name. Beckham was his. The Beckhams, the famous footballer.
David Beckham, Victoria
Yeah,
Beckham, like
David
the
Beckham.
okay, the
She wrote a poem
soccer
about
players.
David Beckham. Yeah, she wrote a poem about David Beckham, comparing him to Achilles.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on he's very especially in his prime, was a very handsome man. So in that, very physically impressive. So maybe that's yeah.
I think Jeffrey Hill would come forward and go, "This is a case of sort of platonic, what's plutocrat?
Oligarchic commodification.
Yeah, oligarchic consumerism. Yeah, like he's comparing David Beckham's achievement to sort of a great Greek hero. I think Jeffrey Hill was morally disgusted by sort of the implications of the comparison.
Yeah, it was a magisterial contempt that he displayed in that lecture. We'll get to that in a minute. So I have not spent a lot of time with either of these poets. I am a little. I mean, it seems like so when this all happened. This was in fall of 2011, and then it was followed up a little later by a couple of other pieces we'll talk about, but. In that time, Caroline Duffy was the poet laureate. Jeffrey Hill was the Oxford professor of poetry. And in some ways, they seem to exemplify their respective offices. Hill was supremely erudite and, as Angie Malenko says, obscurantist. And Caroline Duffy was, as just about everybody characterizes her as a highly democratic, very interested in popularizing poetry. I think that's pretty fair, objective characterization of her.
Yeah, I think that's quite fair. I could probably argue slightly with obscurantists, but I don't think there's any point. And yes, Hill is pretty obscure, and Duffy is Duffy, to a great benefit. And I think Hill understands that or admits that Duffy is interested her interest in making poetry popular is a good thing. I just think Hill is very against her method.
So we'll get into all of it in a second, but from the outset, I totally enjoyed this lecture Hill gave, in which he is pretty mercilessly disdainful of Carolyn Duffy, like as a poet, as a person, as a thinker, as a lawyer. I mean, he is brutal, but I will say that, like, I enjoyed every moment of it, and as with my favorite criticism, I took great relish in this sort of perfect embodiment of a particular critical perspective without agreeing with many of the things he said, and without even feeling that he was proposing this be the only way one criticized. That it seemed as if he was he was a perfect example of a kind of approach to poetry that was fascinating to listen to, and really had pretty persuasive. And then Carolyn Duffy has this other approach. In a way, I would have loved to hear her take up some of his arguments and contest them, but I think,
me too,
I think, at least based on the interview with her that started this whole controversy, I think the approach she has to poetry probably could find a better representative in someone else. Insofar as it's a legitimate approach to poetry, she doesn't seem like the best equipped defender of that position.
So when you say a better person for that role, would you be talking as a better poet, or someone who can articulate more complex sort of ideas around that popularization of poetry?
I mean, I think I would take either, but I mostly mean the latter, right? Like, even setting aside the quality of the work, because Hill, it's not like we spend a lot of time with Hill's poetry in the course of this discussion. I mean, Linko does do a decent treatment of a poem of his later, but most of this is about making a case for a certain way of approaching poetry. And she, I mean, in September of 2011, Joanna Moorhead published this sort of interview in The Guardian, titled "Carolyn Duffy, Poems Are a Form of Texting." And I mean, I have to say, it reads like an Onion article. Do you have an equivalent to The Onion in the UK?
I do not think we do. Is The Onion, I remember it vaguely from your podcast when you mentioned it, talking about 9/11 culprits being tortured in hell.
Yeah. It's a satirical newspaper. So, like, mostly what they write is headlines. My favorite Onion headline being "Existentialist Firefighter Delays 4 Deaths." Right. Right. So, I mean, it mocks newspapers as well as lots of other things. And this, to me, read almost like an Onion article about an imaginary poet laureate. It's so comical and so dumb.
Yeah, but so stereotypical of sort of that sort of the popularizing urge in the poet laureate, right?
And she's so ineloquent. I mean, shockingly so at times. She says, if you look at rapping, for example, a band like Arctic Monkeys uses lyrics in a poetic way, and using words in an inventive way is at the heart of youth culture in every way. I mean, it's just terrible. It's just staggeringly clumsy.
And the funniest thing is that she says, if you look at rapping, and she mentions a pop band who aren't rappers.
Right. It's not like, is that a rap band? I mean, but yeah, so the central claim she makes that Hill most takes issue with is this claim that the poem is a form of texting, text messaging, like in a phone. It's the original text, she says. It's a perfecting of feeling and language. It's a way of saying more with less, just as texting is. We've got to realize that the Facebook generation is the future, and oddly enough, poetry is the perfect form for them. It's a kind of time capsule that allows feelings and ideas to travel big distances in a very condensed form. She goes on. There's some the woman Joanna Moorhead quotes from a not dazzling poem of Duffy's, and then they close with what? Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask you a question about that poem, but we can get to that in a minute.
Yeah, because Hill does take that up in his lecture. And then I'm just curious, because you were a kid when this came out, so you were probably a little young for some of this, but you were, in some ways, like, you were kind of the target of some of these efforts.
Yeah, I was rereading the article today and thinking I am a member of this generation she talks about, and I am a person maybe she'd envisaged as sort of learning from texting to make learning from
Right.
fresh out of texting to make good poems. And I can categorically tell you now, I have not. I mean, I've after I sort of thought about this 4 months ago, I sort of went away and thought, should I like pay attention more to my Instagram messages and try and foster some great poem out of it? But the answer is obviously no, because I think as Hill says so gracefully, texting is truncation and poetry is compression.
And I have some questions about that, but yeah, he is really unhappy with this with this comparison that she makes. Just really quickly because it's
Very
sorry, go.
unhappy in general, right?
Yeah, he's. I mean, he is deliciously cranky throughout. It's really a pleasure to listen. And this is a lecture he gave that I only saw the version you sent me, which is an audio recording, but it really is. I mean, I really can't recommend the audio recording enough. So please do. I hope people will listen to that. I'll include links.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. I mean, I've been trying to recommend all these lectures to people for years now because I stumbled on them when I was 14, and I'd encountered nothing like that in sort of in the poetry media I'd listened to, sort of the almost comedic brilliance and the grumpiness, and even when he was even when he demolishes poets and like through all the lectures, I think he takes apart Larkin quite brutally.
Okay.
He hasn't got a lot of good things to say about Sylvia Plath at the end of this one.
No. He doesn't totally dismiss her, but he's pretty harsh.
No.
Yeah.
He doesn't. To be fair, he doesn't totally dismiss anyone. Like, not
Right.
I think when we get on to Lem Sasay's comments about his treatment of Duffy, I mean, he doesn't totally dismiss Duffy either. But he is. But that's all the brilliance of it, that he doesn't dismiss everyone, but he has a brilliant critical ability to render a poet down a few pegs.
Yeah, I pulled a bunch of quotes from it. And I'll share some during this recording, but I mean, it is just this one lecture, and I think he did like 12 or more. It's so dense with it's just so funny. It's so smart and funny, and so rich a demonstration of a kind of character that's clearly like partly invented, but it's such a real pleasure. I mean, if you listen to a podcast as dumb as this, you should definitely take some time to listen to some of these recordings because they're so good. Just before we get to that though, because there's this weird note at the end of this article about a competition that Duffy set up during her time as poet laureate. It's called the Anthologize competition, and the program involves getting kids to compile anthologies for themselves and then to submit their anthologies along with a budget to, I think it was Penguin, and then Penguin would end up publishing them. That strikes me as a just an obviously terrible idea. Like, if there's anything you would want kids to do with poetry, it wouldn't be anthologize, because the whole point of anthologies is to bring in stuff you haven't seen before.
Like, publish this 14-year-old Spotify list of poems that they only know probably because they've encountered at school. Because most 14-year-olds don't go away and Google more poems. I mean, I did, but I can tell you from my experience when I tried to talk to other class members, I don't think anyone else did.
Hey, I found this new poem last night on Google. It wasn't a great icebreaker for you in middle school.
No, that's not how any friendship group I was ever involved in developed.
So I'm curious, because you referred to Duffy in one of our email exchanges as, you said you think of her as the GCSE poet. And we have, so in the US we have PSATs and ACTs and SATs, but so GCSEs and A levels are two big like secondary school tests that y'all take?
Right, yeah. So they're the big events of a teenager's education before they move on to university or go to get a job. So GCSEs occur when one is about 15 or 16, and A levels occur when one is about 17 or 18.
And what did you mean when you said that Caroline Duffy was the GCSE poet?
So what I meant by that is that when you do GCSE classes, which start from about 12, and you study an anthology of poems that you'll eventually be tested on, Kara and Duffy occurs throughout all the anthologies that are given to students. So there's different exam boards and with different anthologies, and there's some anthologies on war and some anthologies on love. But Kara and Duffy is sort of the go-to English 21st century, late 20th century poet whose poems appear on these anthologies and are given to students. And I think that's mainly because, one, she writes about many common themes and also themes that I think teachers and academics think that students can relate to. She has, I think, did I tell you about the poem that she has that sort of attempts to ventriloquize the voices of a class of students, and it's terrible because it comes off as utterly inhuman and just it's just a load of caricatures. There's a voice of sort of the extreme right wing, lower working class sort of knucklehead, and the voice of the Asian student, and it's embarrassing to read now. But yeah, it's that's sort of how teachers think that students relate to these poems. And they're also, the language isn't very complex. Like, it's nowhere near Hill's sort of obscurantist, dense.
Oh yeah, I mean the language in the poems that were quoted in the Guardian article, the little excerpt Moorhead mentions, when one of her English teachers died, Duffy wrote a poem containing the lines, "You sat on your desk, swinging your legs, reading a poem by Yeats, to the bored girls, except my heart stumbled and blushed as it fell in love with the words, and I saw the tree and the scratched old desk under my hands, heard the bird in the oak outside scribble itself on the air." Yeah, which,
so I was going to ask you, as like as a reader, I don't know, are you a reader or an editor for a magazine? I don't know.
I am, to no great glory or accomplishment, but yeah.
If you fished that poem out of the slush pile,
I mean, the honest answer is I would, if that were it, if there was nothing else there, I would confirm whether she was a friend of anyone on the magazine, and then depending on that fact, I would write either a form or like a notably kind rejection letter, and that's it. And that's really it. It's certainly, like, I've read worse stuff, but it's I mean, it's quite bland, sentimental, and nothing of note happens in the language or in the sound or in the thought or really anywhere. It just seems like, okay, fine.
I think that's a perfect summing up of her. I'm not going to say her entire, because that's too cruel, but a large amount of her oeuvre. It's very competent. She's a very competent writer, but she never rises above competency into sort of, there's no sort of strangeness or intense inventiveness that takes hold that I look for in sort of the poets that I really admire, as in Hill or in many others. There's just a sort of very competent ability to make common, not exactly cliched, but at least common metaphors and similes out of language. But yeah, and I think because that competence isn't extremely difficult or doesn't make too many demands on the reader, that's probably another reason why she's given to students.
My heart goes out to her a little bit. There's also a note in this article was what sounds to me like one of the dumbest poetry controversies I've ever heard of. And I mean, I have to give your countrymen some grief here, because it says in 2008, her Education for Leisure, this is a Duffy poem, a poem about violence, was removed from the AQA Examination Board's GCSE poetry anthology after a complaint about its references to knife crime and a goldfish being flushed down the toilet. It was pulled. Knife crime and a goldfish being flushed? I mean, Jesus Christ. What?
Oh, God. Yeah, that is very, very sad. I find more sad that the people who received the complaints acted on them.
Right, yeah. I mean, I fear for them when they read Thomas Gray's poem. I mean, about a cat drowning in a goldfish bowl. I mean, or, like, let alone like any poem about, say, the Holocaust, or like any kind, like a little bit of knife crime is enough to just shut it all down.
We have at least one slight contestant with sort of the what is the deep and many sort of deep Southern schools in America that routinely like ban so many books if they're
Oh
reading
God!
them.
I mean, though typically I'll say what tends to make us shit our pants is any kind of reference to sex, or especially non-hetero sex. But yeah, I mean,
Right, yeah.
we have an enormous tolerance for knife crime in our in our poetry. So on November 29th that same year in 2011, Geoffrey Hill, Oxford professor of poetry, gave a lecture called "Poetry, Policing, and Public Order," and I think it looks like he gave another lecture with the same title after that, but
Um,
that one I didn't have access to.
that is a big tragedy in my listening to Hill because I've never found that lecture anywhere. It's
Ah,
unavailable. There's another lecture there that's unavailable, but I have found that's on YouTube, which
mm,
is great, which is called Fields of Force. But
okay.
this lecture, this public poetry, policing, and public order too, is nowhere to be seen. And I'm so sad. I want to know which poets Hill sort of demolishes in that one because
Yeah, I mean, good Lord, because well, I mean, you think like, why wouldn't somebody have made a book out of these lectures, if
well,
nothing
yeah,
else, right?
yeah, that is very true. I have wondered that. Why did Hill not publish these lectures? Because
Yeah.
he lived a little bit longer. I mean, it's not a joke, but there's a common statement that Hill was killed by Brexit, which is,
Oh God.
I think in some ways I do, I think it is slightly good that Hill isn't around today because as much as I'd love for Hill to publish 10 more collections of poems, I also think he probably couldn't stand the sort of political landscape that we've gone through in the last few years.
Yeah,
He's
he's
very
quite. I mean,
disgruntled.
he is quite cranky in this.
Yeah.
And I'll also say, like I read a little bit, but it looks like in August of that year there were some riots in response to a police killing of a young man in.
Yeah, the
I wasn't
shooting of
sure what part
Mark
of the
Douglas.
country. So, what do you know the details of this?
Yes, it was in London. I don't want to say the exact place in London because I'll probably get it wrong, and
Right.
it might have been in Brixton. Yeah. So the no, it's not Brixton. I can't remember the riots in London after the shooting of Mark Duggan. Mark Duggan was I think he was generally believed to be an affiliate with a gang or
Okay.
part of a gang, and the police shot him when he was unarmed. He wasn't doing anything threatening. I think he was trying to flee from police and they shot him. And a
Uh,
gun was found later at the crime scene, but it was very far away from Duggan's body.
hmm.
So there is a vast amount of controversy whether he actually had a gun or what took place. Anyway, yeah, there was then a vast series of riots. I don't really have much memory of it now because I think I was on holiday when it happened and I was really too young to have
Right.
noticed.
You were
But
also
yeah,
a kid. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
But it is sort of a big cultural mark in sort of English culture right now. There's a lot
okay.
of there's Caleb Femi, he's not a brilliant poet, but he's a very talented and a very good poet. Has a few good poems on it, but yeah,
Okay.
it's very strong in English circles. Yeah, but so Hill talks about that for a little, and he compares it to the 18th century riots. I think he contextualizes greatly, and I that's one of the things I really like about Hill because I really admire sort of the vast historical landscape he can sort of project onto the events of the modern day, and you can I sort of think of
Yeah.
sort of the widening gyre of history, and sort of Hill peers through it. And yeah, he says that she sees I think he talks about the riots not being quite ordinary in sort of the context of riots, and he sort of launches off into a discussion of justice, which is kind
Yeah.
of related to Duffy and kind of not. But yeah, that's sort of the backstory behind the riots he mentions.
Yeah. That and the title made me think it. I mean, it may be just because I don't have enough context and I don't have the perspective that one might have coming from England, but it felt a little bit to me like a non sequitur. Like he sort of there was a little mention of this, and then we really moved into this other argument about a sort of a democratic versus uh, an aristocratic or elitist he's very particular about defining elitist, but these two different approaches to poetry. He takes up Duffy's interview and he says that he quotes her saying, "The poem is the literary form of the 21st century. It's able to connect young people in a deep way to language. Its language is play." He says, "With the last four words, I am in entire agreement." It's just a withering restraint.
Brilliant, like a brilliant example of foreshadowing. But also,
Right,
it also kind of reminded me of the Amit. I don't know how to say his name, but Amit Mamada's article in the Los
Oh,
Angeles
I don't know how
Review
to
of
say his
Books.
name either. Amit Majumdar is how I think of it.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to be talking to him this week.
Oh,
But yeah, sorry. Go ahead. What you were going to say?
his article in the LA Review of Books about poetry as play,
Hmm.
and I think Jeffrey Hill would agree with most of that, and I agree with most of it,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
I think everyone comes together there, that play and inventiveness, but
yeah.
it's just like a shame that Duffy doesn't demonstrate any play and inventiveness really in most of her
No,
work.
right. I mean, where's like
The
right,
article either.
like that. That's true. I mean, I hadn't thought about that, but that's quite true. Like if that he seems to agree with the claim that languages play more than she does, even though it's her
Mm,
claim.
yeah,
He does. I
yeah,
have to include here because the other night in a conversation I recorded with Alice, we mentioned the famous and famously bad poet William McGonagall, and he just sort of offhand characterizes McGonagall so like brilliantly and hilariously. He says,
yeah.
"Our pleasure in the lunatic, pedantic genius of William McGonagall is a case in point. For him, the exigencies of rhyme urge him to reinvent the stunningly obvious, so that the stunningly obvious has never before appeared with quite this intensity of solemn, imbecile hubris."
It's so utterly true and so precise, and yeah, that
And
is
it's so fair, right? He's so fair to
yeah,
McGonagall, saying like there's something here. It's not
oh yeah,
total garbage, you know.
oh, yeah.
Uh,
I think to claim that McGonagall isn't a genius is pretty silly, because McGonagall is a genius. I think in the Stuffed Owl they say that the best of the very bad poetry is as hard to write as the best of the very good poetry. And McGonagall's work took effort, even if it wasn't intentional effort, and it is brilliantly terrible.
But so he mainly he really takes up this argument with Duffy, saying that poetry. He says, as the laureate says, poetry is condensed. Text is not text being text messages is not condensed. It is truncated. What is more, it is normally an affectation of brevity. So this claim, and this is one that Malenko takes up again later, is I think both like reasonable, and I don't know that it's entirely accurate. Like, how do you? So you this was the thing I think you first mentioned in talking about this article was, or this lecture was, this distinction between condensation and truncation. So what does that mean to you?
I think it's interesting. So truncation and condensation is I always also correct it into my mind to compression. But yeah, so truncation, I guess there's a sort of there isn't. So I'd say that in a poem there's a ratio to sort of sense to language, and that in a
Mm,
very good poem there's normally a higher ratio of sense or meaning. Let's say meaning. I think meaning is better
okay.
than sense. There's a higher ratio of meaning in a phrase or in a couplet or a phrase or a certain line than there is maybe of words, or at least a similar amount. But I think in texting, one meaning is carried by this almost the same, if a little bit more amount of words. And also, I think the truncation he's referring to, he talks about the letter U for the word you, and the letter
Right.
two for
Number two
yo.
for the
Yeah.
word you.
I think he's talking about sort of that unrequired sort of on the fly improvisational fast writing quality of that adds no sort of aesthetic complexity or meaningful complexity, but
Yeah.
just gives off the sense that you're typing as fast as you can to get this over and done with.
Yeah, and it seems like part of what he's getting at too, or at least part of the way I think about texting in distinction to poetry, is that texting, especially the kind of texting he's talking about, which is, as you said, the sort of the rebus texting, or texting with, little what we used to call emoticons, or kind of a parenthesis and colon or whatever. That this is part of it is also it's a kind of a vulgar, ready to hand vocabulary that's not. It doesn't. It is quick and it is easy to do and it is short, but it doesn't express more. And in some cases, it hardly expresses anything. Like I think of like vulgar language as being language that is so familiarly in use that it almost has no scent or taste anymore. It's just like it's almost like filler.
It's bland, a blandishment, right?
Yeah.
And there's also sort of a mathematical efficiency to sort of U for U and two for two, but that efficiency isn't bolstered or backed up by any sort of linguistic or conceptual efficiency. It's just an efficient machine turned out text or social media message.
Yeah, I think it's maybe kind of a lost art now because there's hardly any call for it. But there was people used to have shorthand was like a really refined practice that like secretaries would have. And I know it plays a part in Dracula because I think Harker keeps his diaries in shorthand, so Dracula can't read them. But this was, I mean, this is really what it seems like. It's just like you need an existing language in order to have these little sort of cheap tricks for representing words using a smaller character, but it's not really it's not actually condensing anything.
Yeah, I mean in Braille you get a sort of shorthand version of all of many words, which is just one sign. So yeah, there is that sort of way of condensing language without ever condensing language to extend or enlarge or complicate meaning.
So I thought Braille was a representation of an alphabet.
Yes, that's grade 1 Braille, and then grade 2 Braille you get signs that just stand for a word. So for instance, the word "the," you can literally have one sign that stands for THE.
Oh, huh.
It gets very complex.
So is grade 2, and when you say grade 2 Braille, that's like when you're reading a book or something beyond like a bathroom sign or like something at a higher level. Is that all grade 2 Braille?
Yeah, it would probably be published in grade 2. It really depends on the company's viewpoint. But yes, grade 2 Braille is normally what most Braille is.
And so is that then it's not phonetic?
No, I guess it isn't. So phonetic is in the words, yeah. So it's not, no.
Like there's no representation of the little sounds that make up the word in the.
No, not really.
Wow.
Obviously, no, they're not short forms. We call them short forms in grade 2. They're not short forms of every word, but there's enough that they will appear at least once or twice in almost every single sentence.
Right, because Braille books can only be printed on one side. Is that right? So there's just it takes up more space.
I don't read much Braille books anymore, but I once read a Braille book that had, I think it was watership down. It was printed on both pages, on both sides of the page, I think. But actually, though, there might have been a blank page between it. But yes, I think you're right, actually, because if it was printed on both sides, I think the bumps that appear on the other side of the page would interfere. So yes, I think you're right.
Huh. So
it's cumbersome.
Right. Yeah. And so you understand why you would want to shorten the representation of words because you would end up taking up less space. And I don't want to get us totally off track, but I'm curious, if you don't read in Braille, is it mostly audio? What do you?
Oh, okay. So I do read in Braille, but I read mostly on technology now.
Okay. So what is that?
The Braille will come up on like a machine called a Braille Note, which is like a laptop. Like an iPad, actually. Yeah, it's like an iPad, but it has all the functionality and.
So it has like the little bumps will come up.
Yeah, it has a Braille
for you to read them, and then they'll go back down and change for the next line or whatever. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
So for poetry, is poetry represented with short forms, or is it all grade 1 or?
Oh no, it's short forms. No, they don't. I don't think anyone would be interested enough to in poetry to make a sudden distinction like that. No, it is all short forms, poetry and prose. There's no distinction.
That seems so crazy, though, given the importance of sound. I mean, maybe it surprises me particularly because of your interest in sound and poetry. Like that there's not a representation of the sound in the word. I mean, huh?
Yes, But I see what you mean, but because I read out so much, I can hear the sound anyway. So
Right.
it doesn't seem to matter to me too much if the words on the page are not completely spelled phonetically. And I
Sure.
don't know. I think there's a kind of I mean all phoneticism only gets you so far, especially in English when half
Right,
the
right,
words
right. Yeah.
spelled in a different way to you pronounce them. But yeah.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, I think just my own experience reading is that I'm a very slow reader, and partly it's because I have to make the sounds of all the words when I read them in my head.
Mm.
But I also think like when I imagine words, there's maybe they're just sort of separate separate banks of memory for me. One being the visual and one being the auditory. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that's interesting. I don't. Yeah, hmm. I guess I guess I would equate that to the auditory and
the
the feel
tactile.
of the word. Yeah, the tactile. But they are.
Like
I think they're so interlinked for me that it's very hard to distinguish. I don't think I have two different banks.
right,
I sort of have I have a strange synesthesia as well. I can obviously I've never seen colors, but I can sort of associate colors with scents and feels and tastes. And that
right.
yeah, my mind works in a very sort of synesthetic way, which is sort of my great claim to fame with Rembo is that we both had synesthesia.
Yeah, and Baudelaire too, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I did Baudelaire write a poem on synesthesia. I know Rembo.
Isn't
Is
that
it?
Baudelaire's
I
correspondences?
always
Doesn't
pronounce his
he?
name wrong. It's Rambo, isn't it? Pardon?
Yeah, I think isn't Baudelaire's correspondences? Isn't that about synesthesia partly?
Oh, yes, it might be. I never
I
read
think
it in that way, but
I'm
yeah.
never and I that's a it's funny because I have synesthesia is one of those psychological experiences that I've never had any connection to. Like I don't. I mean, maybe the only way I've had a connection to it is with language, where there's that overlap. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's like it's always like Ryan talks a lot about. He's very into synesthesia, but it's I have very
Uh-huh.
little access to that. But yeah, that's interesting. It would make me curious about your experience of because I'm always convinced that when people talk about reading, they're talking about 15 different things and just calling it the same thing. And so
Uh-huh.
it makes me curious about like how you digest as you read. But
I dragged you like off course so badly here.
no. I mean, it's fascinating. I'm very curious about that. But so yeah, so he says poetry is condensed. Text is trunk. It's sorry, text is not condensed. It is truncated. I think my maybe
Yeah,
my
what are your objections to it?
yeah. So I think I. I mean, I think what's true is like as Brad Lighthouser has said, said in a lecture a million. There's a lecture actually where I met my wife. He said that in poetry you take the line for the mountain, and I think that's quite true. You just a little image or a little suggestion will bring a whole scene into the mind.
Uh-huh.
But I guess I don't think of that as condensation. I think of it as elegance. Like to me, it's not so much about the density or the compression of the work that contain like a little bit contains a lot. It's more like a little bit does a lot. But I also tend to think of poems mostly in terms of the effect they have on the
Uh-huh.
reader. So it
So yeah, so I guess you're drawing a distinction between sort of idation or multiplicity and sort of and imagistic the imagistic ability of a phrase, right? So
sorry,
when sort of
say that again. I need to I
so
need to
when
think about that.
let me use an example because
Sure.
I talking in the abstract is very bad. So when Hill says when he takes his line from the Mystery of the Charity of Charles Peggy, which is a poem of his that he mentions in the lecture, but only to quote a line from it, which was then quoted as an epigraph to
No, I mean that section made me laugh. But
a
yeah,
he in that line he says to dispense comma with justice semicolon or to dispense with justice, so it's sort of punning on the idea of either punning on the phrase to dispense with justice and whether
yeah,
that means getting rid of justice or to use justice in a proper lawful way.
right,
So that is a line that I think is sort of ideationally packed, so packed with meaning as sort of concept and idea. Well, we could take I can't think of any right now. my mind's going to. There's Emily Dickinson does it a lot when she sort of comes up with a line that's packed with
Yeah, yeah.
has a lot of image.
Success in Circuit Lies is one of those
Yeah,
crammed lines. Yeah.
that's a great. There's a fantastic line by her. I love when she's talk. She doesn't mention death. She talks about a skull. Maybe she does mention death. I can't remember. But she says something that drills his welcome in.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. So it's the very end of a poem. The possibility to pass without a moment's spell into conjecture's presence is like a face of steel that suddenly looks into ours with a metallic grin, the cordiality of death who drills his welcome in.
Yeah, I mean,
cordiality of death who drills his welcome in.
Yeah, that is amazing.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's so image packed, right? That does so much in so few words with so many images. Or not even with so many images, but with one image.
So the distinction you're drawing is between like an elegant articulation of ideas versus a potent and briefly expressed image. Is that kind of the distinction you're making? Or
yeah,
okay.
that's exactly the distinction I'm making. You put it far more elegantly than I.
Yeah.
But yes, that's it. Yeah, and I think you can. I think those both come under the idea of compression. I think Hill would probably accept both as sort of examples of what he's talking about.
I'm curious because it seemed to me as if the whole policy, public order, policing stuff felt disconnected from most of the argument of the lecture. He does use this phrase "policing one's patch" a number of times to talk about both what Duffy does in characterizing poetry and what he does.
It's certainly kind of idiomatic speech. Policing. I always think of it as sort of. I think he really wants to make clear that he's got working class. He has working class origins.
Right. And yeah. He says both of them seem to grow up poor and without a lot of education around them.
And he wants to, and he sort of thinks that Duffy has gone down this route of encouraging that everyone else from poor or not even poor backgrounds, or many different backgrounds, will love poetry and fall in love with poetry, and she wants to popularize it, and she's sort of policing her justly democratic patch in that way, while he's trying to amplify his own view that we should look at complexity of poetry and not take any old poem to heart. But police, I've never thought about it too critically, I will say.
I mean, it may not matter. I every time I hear it, I think it just seems like an odd inclusion of a thought to me.
I think it's certainly idiomatic in England, so maybe.
Okay. Quickly on the question of class, because he doesn't, as you say, he makes that point quite strongly, that he's a little bit contemptuous in adopting the phrase, but he calls himself and Duffy both children of the underprivileged, with a little bit of a wink to it. So I'm curious, this is a super English point of distinction that I don't, you can tell me how much it matters. I know that like in the US, we have a lot of accents over here, but they don't seem to be quite as strictly loaded with meaning as accents in the UK. Like there seems like there's sort of like there's like newscaster, nobody accent. And then there's like a very pronounced Midwestern accent, which we tend to associate with like a wholesome naivete. And then like a very pronounced outer borough New York accent that we associate with like a no nonsense pragmatism, and then like a rural Southern accent is just everybody's shorthand for like total ignorance and provincialism. So outside of that, like they're not as strictly. Their meanings are not as fixed as they seem to be in the UK. Is there to my ear, he speaks with an almost exaggerated RP like Rada posh accent. Am I hearing, like, I'm assuming this would have been, as with Patrick Stewart, who who like grew up with a very different way of speaking than he uses today. Is this is there a meaning to this, or is there not? Is like, am I hearing anything meaningful there?
There's probably certainly a meaning. I doubt that was the accent he was born with, and he grew up probably in a time when if you wanted to enunciate and speak clearly in public, you probably had to train that out of you. I don't
Okay.
have any evidence to suggest that he did so, but I'm just going by supposition. I think right now we're sort of witnessing the death of that accent. I know there's a big pushback against people correcting sort of their native accent or the accent they were born with. So sort of people from the north, people from sort of the north of England who then come to speak on the news, and people from sort of inner city London who have a sort of a kind of Cockney accent. There's a
Right.
big push on those people not to be sort of forcibly changed to a more acceptable RP Southern accent.
Okay.
So we're sort of witnessing the death of that. But I think back in sort of the day of the 60s and the 50s and the 70s, and maybe even up to the 80s and the 90s, I think Hill would have definitely had to attempt to standardize his accent in some way. I
Okay.
can hear something of sort of a slight Worcestershire note in his
Okay.
voice, but that's probably because I'm slightly more attuned, being an English person, to the subtleties. But yeah, you are correct that he does speak in a he's to be fair, I do love the way he speaks. He speaks with such brilliant enunciation and such sort of
Oh yeah.
when he reads a poem, he speaks with sort of a grim, almost violent power to it. That's I've never heard anyone read poems. And I listened to a poetry reading of him reading his poems on YouTube, and I was slightly disappointed because he reads a Shakespeare sonnet incredibly effectively, and like no one else on the planet. But he doesn't exactly read his poems like he reads Shakespeare sonnets, and it's a slight tragedy.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. He's very funny, but it is. I
Yeah,
mean, the gravity
but
with which he reads even the Carolyn Duffy lines that he approves of is so it is so it so overburdens the language, which feels pretty thin to me, even in the better of the poems.
yeah,
That it's yeah, it
when you
feels like
believe,
only certain poems could survive that kind of enunciation. So and just to clarify for all of the ignorant Yanks and Aussies listening, when you say a Southern accent in the UK,
uh,
that's the what we think of as like the Queen's English, Southern being London, being
yeah,
upper crusty people.
yeah, the upper class,
Okay,
kind London, and sort of even more deep south than that, but not, yeah,
okay.
around that.
And if this is not an untoward question for all of our untrained ears, with what accent do you speak?
I, whoa, my accent is southern. It
Okay,
isn't Queen. I don't. It's not RP. I don't think. Other people can form their own opinions. I don't really know what it is. It's
okay.
sort of a bastardized southern thing.
All right. So to get to the real fighting words that that Hill launches at Duffy, he really picks some nits. Like he's very fussy about he fusses at her about he fusses at the Guardian about representing line breaks with slashes versus vertical lines, which I
Yeah,
confess I was
I,
always taught to use slashes, so I don't even know what he's talking about.
I think he was wrong. I've never seen anyone use vertical lines that much. I don't know. He seems pretty clearly wrong in this instance.
But he says what Professor Duffy desires to do, I believe, is, and if so, it is a laudable ambition, is to humanize the linguistic semantic detritus of our particular phase of oligarchical consumerism, and for the common good, she is willing to have. This is brutal. He says, for the common good, she is willing to have quoted by the Guardian interviewer several lines from a poem by herself that could easily be mistaken for a first effort by one of the young people she wishes to encourage.
And
Oh
then he
man.
later says, "I wouldn't have the bravery to do this," and also comments that this sort of detritus language shares many similarities to sort of the detritus and cliche of Mills and Boone.
Yeah, oh
Are
yeah.
you
So
familiar?
he goes on, and I wanted to get you to fill in some English details here. He goes on to
Right.
say, My first response is that this is democratic English pared to its barest being, and I would not myself have the moral courage to write so. My simultaneous incompatible response is that this is not democratic English, but cast off bits of oligarchical commodity English, such as is employed by writers for Mills and Boon and by celebrity critics appearing on A Good Read or The Andrew Marrs Show. His tone, I think, is pretty unmistakable, but would you clarify for us what those references are?
Okay, so Mills and Boon is a series of not exactly pornographic, but sort of... and
sorry, I laughed. Sorry, not exactly pornographic what?
Sort of not exactly pornographic, but sort of soft and smutty romance, cheap romance books that are sort of turned out to give sort of people a sort of cliched sexual thrill.
So what we in here might call like Harlequin romance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then A Good Read is a BBC radio program.
Yes. I think it used to be. There's also yes, I think so. The Andrew Marr. Are you familiar with the Andrew Marr Show?
Some kind of talk show. What species of talk show?
I don't think he chose the Andrew Marr Show. I think he could have chosen a better example. The Andrew Marr Show is a political program on the BBC, where the presenter Andrew Marr normally goes into politics, but it normally does have a section devoted to a slight part of culture, and he's probably talking about the occasions when celebrities who have written autobiographies come on and are interviewed. And I think those are sort of the sections that the sort of the bathos sections between sort of the pathos of contemporary politics and international world affairs.
I wonder if he chose that because that was as low as his brow got. There may be more apt or more damning comparisons, but maybe he didn't have access to them, is my suspicion.
He claims he doesn't use the internet, and so maybe.
He
reads out the WordFest article that I think refers to Strictly Come Dancing when it talks about celebrities. Whatever the Dancing with the Stars or whatever British version of that. Yeah, he is really withering in his dismissal of the WordFest, but then he also condemns all of the highbrow literary festivals, and he says they are. He says they are essentially book fairs, though without the chance excitement of finding anything good. Yeah, he's publishing jamborees that he thinks Oxford should never commit themselves and should not give their prestige to.
Right. Yeah, he's pretty scornful of and he says at one point with like really audible disdain, like he wouldn't be surprised if it were like a top Oxford English graduate who wrote this. That he's pretty harsh on the institution that's hosting him. But God bless him for it. So you had said to me that you thought he wasn't so hard on Duffy because he does make a point of saying he quotes a single stanza from a poem she wrote called The Christmas Truce about the famous truce during World War I, and he praises her use of the verb treasured to describe the glittering rhyme on unburied sons treasured their stiff hair. The stanza itself before that isn't great, and again, this is the stanza where his reading voice almost crushes it to death before he can get to his praise of it. And he can't resist saying, although the words thrilled and glittering are words that come with a standard poetry kit, treasured is beautifully chosen and placed. So it seems to me like he's doing the barest possible gesture of conciliation, saying like, she's picked a good word now and then, despite all of her limitations.
So I think it's also strategically clever though, because if you're gonna take down a poet for their uninventive, ill choice of comparison between poetry and communication methods, what else than to pick that same poet to illustrate your view of good poetry or your view of good poetic skill?
No. I mean, I think it is certainly canny of him. I just think that.
Yeah, I think I'm going to revise my. When I wrote an email, I was probably slightly still stinging from Lemsisay's silly article. But yeah, I think he's very brutal to Duffy.
Yeah.
And yeah, you are true there. He could have picked so many better contemporary poets, so many better contemporary poems to sort of give a good example of this. But The thing with when Hill talks about oligarchical detritus and consumerism is that his criticism is based on a very sort of complex and deep understanding of language, and like he he makes I think in that lecture he makes reference to Joseph Goebbels, and he sort of
Yeah, yeah.
thinks of I think he gets his sort of moral imperative from the idea that he thinks that dictators and mass murderers and political war criminals like to debase and simplify language in order to take control of the masses.
Yeah.
And he looks around that and he finds any sort of simplified poems and he says this is undemocratic because it's debasing language, and instead of challenging the reader and attempting to lift the reader to a more complex plane of perceiving and understanding, it simply it works to like the hopes and wishes of the lowest common denominator. So I think he sees a moral imperative to go after Duffy in that way.
Yes. Oh, no. And I actually think that I'll jump around a little bit because I want to talk about it. You sent all these great little, it's a great reading packet you supplied. But so I'll just quickly to jump. There's and I'll have links to all this obviously in the show notes. But Angie Malenko, and I have no idea how to say her name. I have an invitation out to her. Ange, please do come on the show and tell me how to pronounce your name. But Angie Malenko has a really smart guide, as you said, to a poem by Hill called On Reading Crowds and Power. And I actually think she does quite a good job of articulating his objection to some of this demotic speech. She says, accustomed as we are to celebrating the vernacular in 20th century poetry, we forget that for some modernists, the vernacular represented not the language of the street, but the homogenized language of newspapers, government spokesmen, and corporate shills. These entities, who represent a small, powerful elite, or in Hill's word, oligarchy, use a basic or debased language to persuade the masses to vote in a certain way, to acquiesce to authority, and to buy things. Such language, what we commonly call propaganda or advertising slogans, is not intended to foster debate, though it may feign objectivity. I think that's right on the nose.
Yeah, it's so true. There's a really good example of this with an English Prime Minister a few years ago called David Cameron, and he was asked his favorite football team, and he gave an answer. And I won't say which because I can't remember which football team he gave. And then he was asked, and then he commented in another interview that he supported a different football team. And this is sort of I think Hill would go and say this is a very minor but good example in microcosm of how like the oligarchs are pretending to be invested in the language of, as Malenko says, the street and the common people, but actually just debasing that language and just using that language to their own personal gain.
No, I think
that's an extreme example with the Nazis and Joseph Goebbels. That's sort of, I think that I imagine it almost like a tower of horrible debased language that peaks with Goebbels and then goes down with David Cameron and then goes down to get David Cameron saying one football team and then the other. And they're obviously not the same, but I think they share a slight thread of debasement, the debasement of language between them. And I think Hill would see that and sort of make a connection.
His other line on it is, the cult of sincerity plays into the hands of the spivs and charlatans of our anarchical plutocracy. Just quickly, because I had to look it up, spivs is not, in fact, an ethnic slur, as it sounds like to an American ear.
Yeah, it isn't an ethnic slur. I couldn't give you a perfect definition. I always thought of it as just like, I always think of it as just a charlatan, just another word for a charlatan.
Yeah, so at least the American Heritage definition relates it to the word spiffy, which is 1930s slang. So it says a man typically characterized by flashy dress who makes a living by disreputable dealings.
I think the idea of like people trying to get you to buy something and get you to buy something that's not very good, but making out to seem as if this thing is incredible.
So, this is it's funny because when I read it, the line about Mills and Boone, my assumption, and then I think I have a false memory of looking it up because I thought I'd confirmed this, and it turns out I'm totally wrong about it. My assumption was that Mills and Boone was a famous advertising firm, which seems in some ways not inappropriate.
You're not totally wrong.
His treatment of Duffy comes up again in this other Guardian piece that you sent me. by Lem Sissay that's called Poetic Heavyweights. It came out in January of 2012. And I mean, I will say, like, this whole article reads like advertising language. I mean, it all reads like these sort of brainless slogans or Hallmark card sentiments. I mean, it's one of the dumbest pieces of writing I've ever seen attributed to a poet in public. So Lem Sissay is a popular English poet, is that, or a British poet?
He's quite popular. He published a few years ago an autobiographical book about his problems with adoption and how he went through the adoption system and the violence that was done to him, called My Name Is Why. A lot of people like it. I haven't read it, but he is also a popular poet. And I tried to get for a book of his selected poems, I think a year ago, and it was not good. It really, like, I read a poem that really demonstrated why you needed to learn meter to write in a rhyme. I was reading through another book of his poems just before we talked, just to get my mind in order about some to say. And to be fair, those poems were better, but they shared the same problem with Duffy of containing common metaphors that are not quite cliches, but not very original either, and containing common sentiment that is never ever validified, never sort of confirmed or made interesting by inventiveness of language. So yes, he's another common accessible poet who doesn't seem particularly talented, and probably, I would say, slightly less competent than Duffy.
So he is critical of Hill. He says in talking about Hill's lecture about in part about Duffy, he says Hill demeans himself. After 350 years of male dominance, Duffy is the first female poet laureate. Hill's comparison of the language of Duffy to Mills and Boone is like a man in the 1950s comparing the first female managing director to a jumped up office angel. I'm assuming office angel is like slang for a secretary.
Yeah, secretary, even less so than a secretary.
So
a female typist in a typing pool.
Yeah, so I think your initial response was that Hill does have some redeeming remarks about Duffy's poetry. I mean, I think as we've talked about, like, I think he is pretty hard on her, but it also seems to me this characterization seems totally unfair. I think Hill is quite hard on Duffy, but Duffy's the fucking poet laureate. Like, if anybody is fair game for criticism, it seems to me as if he is treating her with more respect by being so harsh than if he had tiptoed around her because she's a woman. I mean, that just seems incredibly condescending of Sissay.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. That entire statement seems confusing and so misplaced and utterly incorrect in several places. But yes, but Hill gives Duffy so much critical attention,
right,
that he's either not misogynistic or incredibly so deeply misogynistic that he has to invent incredibly complex literary and critical frameworks to justify it. And I don't think that's true. So yes, there's no misogyny in this, into what I can see in the podcast. He had another podcast, he compares Emily Dickinson to Alan Turing and says you need a poet with the genius level of Alan Turing, like Emily Dickinson.
The claim, like the claim that, I mean, it seems to me like you couldn't produce the criticism that Hill offers of Duffy if you didn't take both her and her office seriously. Right, that seems to be the only way that happens. I mean, I disagree with plenty Hill says, but I certainly don't think he is at all unfair or at all demeans himself with his conduct.
No, not at all.
No,
demeans himself by his seeming lack of understanding of history. He says, after 350 years of male dominance, what does he think, that men and female poets were great before 350 years ago? Like,
what happened 350 years ago? Like,
it's such a, and he doesn't even say, like, he doesn't contextualize it within England. Like, you could take his comments just about the world. We could, after a few million years of male dominance,
No, that's quite true. But yeah, I mean, it is a stultifying piece of writing. He says, this is an adult published, celebrated poet publishing in an adult newspaper, commenting on the poet laureate and the Oxford professor of poetry he says a poet is not by nature by nature not a team player. There's no I in team, but then there's no you either. Poets are at the heart of revolution because revolution is the heart of the poet. I mean, this is really just like, this could be in a fucking Hallmark card. This could be a bumper sticker. It's terrible.
It's an odd mass of sort of, to quote Hill, it's an odd mass of sort of debased oligarchical consumerist speech flung together, and it seems to have no understanding of tone. He jumps straight from saying Geoffrey Hill is a misogynist to saying, why doesn't Geoffrey Hill tweet his review of Caroline Duffy's poems on Twitter, and then they can trend? And it's
right. It's so bizarre. That ending is so, then he can upload his review via a Facebook status update, which should be synced to his tweets, and hopefully it'll trend. What the fuck are you talking about? This is, I mean, Jesus Christ, who approved this opinion piece? I don't.
Yeah, like, I guess I don't think The Guardian has a very good run with poetry. There are much better publications for poetry opinions and poems than The Guardian.
So in terms of they're like strong both political and intellectual matrices along which the British periodicals are recognizably placed. So I know like the Telegraph is very conservative, and the Guardian is like mainstream liberal. Is that accurate?
Yes, basically mainstream liberal.
Okay. But then is there like on the intellectual axis, there's like the Times, and then the Times is more highbrow, or what? Like where do all these line up?
Well, I'd say the intellectual of the axis of The Guardian is quite high if you do not think of poetry, if you do not publish poetry.
Okay, yeah.
And if you don't really, its reviews are mainly a lot of buzzwords. Like I could write many good parodies of Guardian reviews of books, of poems, or of prose, and it would be fresh, exciting, innovative writing.
Luminous.
Yeah, a lot of sincere, true, heartfelt. And they don't. I think it has better film reviews than it does of literature, I'm going to say.
Okay. But, I mean, all of which would be pretty consistent with the most prestigious U.S. periodicals as well, which often have brilliant film reviews and just lobotomized poetry reviews.
I think the reviews in the New Yorker, as bad as they are probably 5 times more intelligent than The Guardian.
The Guardian's really scraping the bottom of the barrel. All right. So, I strongly recommend the Hill lecture, and I want to talk a little bit more about a couple of things he mentions in there. I will include links to all this. Though, as you had the experience, as did I, that Poetry Foundation links have been really fucking up lately. They've really been hard, very inconsistent, very difficult for me to get access to them. So God knows if they'll work.
The big poetry controversy of the week for me. What the fuck is up with the Poetry Foundation? What
I don't know.
Doing?
As much as I make fun of them, it is really nice to have access to their index of like poetry essays and poems online, because they do have just a ton. I mean, that's like, if you're going to get $100 million from an evil pharmaceutical company, like at least give your magazine away for free online, which they do, and they have a lot of other poems. So that, I mean, their website is really their greatest virtue. So I hope they get this shit fixed.
Well, I think so. When I was 13, I got into poetry after I was reading Stephen King, and I heard Child Roll Into the Dark Tower Came by Robert Browning, read at the end of King's Dark Tower series, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. And then I went off and wrote a terrible imitation of it. But when I was branching out into poetry, when I was fascinated by poetry, the Poetry Foundation was essential for me. That's how I encountered mainly all the great poets of sort of the English and American tradition, and many critical articles. The Guardian, the Poetry Foundation, for all its flaws, is I think probably the best, or at least the most detailed poetry archive on the internet.
And I mean, and not for nothing. And actually, I actually am curious about how formatting affects you. But just for those who can look at it, it is a lot nicer to read than like so many poetry sites are published in a way that's just painful to look at, and so they do have a nice format, and it's easy enough on the eyes. I'm curious. So for you, is all of that formatting I guess like formatting and font and all that is that essentially wiped clean or
Yeah, formatting. So fonts in italics don't really appear for me or don't work for me. So
okay.
there's really no connection. I would say form because I don't the device. So the braille note that reproduces all of this, it doesn't working up or down. It's just I
Everything's
think it's
linear.
yeah everything's
Okay.
linear. And
How does
so
it
the
how's
best
it how
yeah
does it
go
show
on.
line breaks?
So line breaks are fascinating to talk about. So this is I'm trying to explain this simply. So the Braille note, when I'm in like a Word document or when I'm typing, doesn't actually do a line break, as in the lines are placed below each other. It has a symbol for a line break, and
Huh.
then you just keep reading straight on.
Okay.
But on
So
a
it's like the
website,
slash or something.
yes, it's like the slash. But on a
Okay.
website, it does the lines are below each other. Obviously you can't see more than one line, you can only fill one line at a time because it isn't because there's no sort of three-dimensional space. It's just
Right. So the
left and right.
line like the line on your computer populates with a line and then that one goes away and the next one comes up and that's how you know
Exactly.
it's a new line.
Yes, but it's so
Okay.
annoying that this doesn't happen in when I'm writing in the Word document. This only happens on the internet.
Oh,
it's always amused me because you'd think from that experience that I'd write many prose poems because the line break doesn't affect me, but I've
right.
somehow got this odd obsession with the line break, and I almost write no prose poems. But yeah, so that's how the line break.
No, that is fascinating, and it's funny. I've been thinking about line breaks a lot more lately because I realized that like though one of my perennial questions about free verse poetry is how do you determine the line breaks? I realize that when it comes to at least my own poetry, all of which at the moment is metrically regular,
Uh-huh.
I've come to think of the line breaks as being almost like they exist in the sound of the poem so much that the
Exactly. Yeah.
presentation on the page hardly matters. And I've taken to just because I find it's easier to get published this way, I've taken to re-breaking my lines on the page so that they don't look regular. Because
Yes. There's a
yeah,
word
but
for that.
was there a word for that specifically? I
There's
know
a
other
word
people. I
for
know like
metrical.
me, Joshua Megan, and other people have done it before.
Yeah, there's
Um,
a word for metrical poetry that does not break at the rhyme word. Um,
huh.
I've
Um,
forgotten. I remember when I told you like almost a year ago now about commercial poetry, that website that hates almost all contemporary poetry and has a
oh, is
very
that Jennifer Reeser's page, or is she just on it? I can't remember.
she's on it. It's run by
Some Ratosphere person.
he used to be on a Ratosphere. He isn't
Okay.
anymore. I can't remember his name. He's he was very he like think he his general thesis is that the best poems of the 20th century or the 21st century were all on a Ratosphere and Poetry Free for All and the
Wow.
Poets.org forum. And that
Okay.
yeah. And have you heard of M.A. Griffiths?
I probably just like in passing reference in like I've probably seen his name or the name come up on some of these websites, but I don't. Yeah, I don't
She
know it.
was she was sort of this very revered Eratospherian. I think she was a woman in England, and she died in 2007 quite tragically. I think
Wow.
of her stomach. I don't know if it was cancer. I need to confirm all this information. I feel like I'm giving out too much false information tonight.
Right.
But she died quite suddenly, and her body wasn't discovered for a few days. And the sort of the Eratosphere community and the sort of broader community of poetry forums came together and actually got a book of poems by her published called Grasshopper: The Poetry of M.A. Griffiths.
Oh, is that
And
and Abel Muse runs that?
yes, I think it was
Okay.
Able Moon.
Because
It was
I
I
know. I think I've seen
maybe
that
Able Moon.
cover on their
Yeah,
website.
there's a small publisher in England, I think, published it. And so commercial poetry sort of holds her up as sort of the greatest 21st century poet. And I've read through her poems, and I thought, well, she's good, but I think Philip Larkin did all she's done more effectively.
Right.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
I personally don't think she's the best 21st century poet. I think even sort of poets that are being published in the wider journal world and are quite famous, like Ishon Hutchinson.
Right.
If I had to stake a claim to sort of the greatest
Right.
poet alive now, I'd probably say Ishon Hutchinson.
Okay. Yeah. 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 But before, yeah. So I want to like somewhat resolve some of these these questions we brought up with Hill. So he has this kind of big statement he makes, couple big statements he makes later in the lecture. He says, in order to do anything of worth in literature, you must create not what is newsworthy or praiseworthy in the terms of the festival pundits, but something that is self-contained and in which the stresses are right. And he goes on to say, I'm policing my patch when I insist that any poetry written today worthy of being read for anything other than antiquarian curiosity in 50 or 100 years' time will have been written with a kind of savage technical restraint, somewhat akin to Swift's Latin epitaph and Yeats' translation of it, mechanically and with a near perfect sense of timing. And the Yeats translation of Swift's Latin epitaph is, Swift has sailed into his rest, savage indignation there cannot lacerate his breast. Imitate him if you dare, world besotted traveler, he served human liberty. Yeah, is that, what do you think of that? Are those accurate I mean, again, in some ways, like I find it easier sometimes to endorse his tone than his claims in the by the letter. Uh, in this one, I'm not sure. You must create
Okay.
not what is newsworthy or praiseworthy in the terms of the festival, but something that is self-contained and in which the stresses are right. I guess that's kind of hard to argue with.
Yeah, it's quite hard to. It's quite hard when you say this. So if you say this, look at this young poet. Their poems are so relevant to our modern situation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I think, but in 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 years, when their poems aren't relevant, are there other are there other qualities of the poems that will keep them being remembered? Is there sort of a technical brilliance or an inventive linguistic brilliance, or are they
right.
do they just say things that we we can sort of think about now and sort of go, oh yes, I agree with that, and move
Yeah.
on, you know?
And then he's slightly more specific when he says that anything worth being read in 100 or 50 years, 50 or 100 years time, for poetry's sake, for the sake of itself, will have been written with a kind of savage technical restraint. Um,
Savage. I love that savage technical
it's a
restraint.
great phrase.
I want to turn into a savage technical restraint. I think, you know.
He goes on. I mean, I can't remember if it's before or after. He talks about, he's very dismissive of what he calls the cult of sincerity. He says it's important almost not, to abandon sincerity in writing poetry. That's not certainly, you shouldn't try to be yourself. I think I sympathize with his impatience more than I fully approve his statements.
Have you got any sort of disagreement with the statement that you could vocalize? Because I'm interested in sort of seeing your disagreement with it.
If he had said, and I don't have his precise phrasing of it, but I think if what he had said was, those who claim that you must be sincere and you must be yourself when writing, though they are wrong to claim that. I think I would entirely agree with that claim. Like,
Yeah.
no, it's ridiculous to say you must be yourself or you must be sincere when writing poetry. But to say he seems, I mean, again, I don't have the precise phrase, but he seems almost to say, don't be yourself and don't be sincere. Yeah, I mean, well, let me put it this way, like, depending on what his claim is, like, if his claim is only that one needn't be these things, then, like, fine, of course, yes, I totally agree. Go
I
ahead.
think this was a superlative force to it that makes it seem as if he's saying, don't be yourself and never write sincere poems. I think what lies underneath it is sort of him saying, being sincere and being yourself should be the last of your worries. You should apply yourself to saying the thing you want to say with the words in the best order, with the best technique you can muster. And
Yeah,
whether that thing is about yourself or about aliens on Mars or about dogs or about racism in America or whatever,
sure.
the subject is almost the least important thing when you've got the playful inventiveness, and I mean play not as in unseriousness, but as in
Right.
inventiveness and sort of linguistic charge. I think that is he wants poets to place that at the top of sort of the sheet of things they need to go over to make a poem. I think he wants sincerity to be at the very bottom.
Yeah, and I think like I'm definitely with him in suspecting that like when distinguishing between the good and, as Stephen Dunn would say, the not so good, the difference
Yeah.
seldom, if ever, lies in the degree of sincerity
Yeah.
or the degree of like trueness to self. That's almost never what makes the difference between good and bad or good and better. Uh, but I do think, I mean, I guess part of it is that right now we are flooded by a trend of, at least over here, poems that are embarrassingly sincere. Jonathan Farmer's talked about this sort of bruised, tender sentimentality in a lot of contemporary American poetry, and that is really, really tiresome and often just deadly dull and humorless. And that, of course, like I similarly find that frustrating and not interesting. But I think I was surrounded when I was an undergrad by a lot of poetry that was playful or inventive to such a like a limited end. Like it was playful and inventive and like nothing but, and it really never
Yeah.
went further than the phrase or the line, and it was merely
I
tried
have
to be surprising line by line and nothing but, and that is also incredibly tiresome.
Yeah, I think I have a theory about my distaste for language poetry and my distaste for movement poetry. Do you know what the movement is?
And I mean, my only knowledge of the movement is that the most famous member was Larkin. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so Larkin was the most famous and best member, and
Okay.
he wasn't like the aesthetic masthead of the movement. He didn't issue their dictats, but he
Sure.
was their best example. So it was a
Okay.
group of English poets in the 50s and 60s that reacted against the experimentation of modernism and said we should not write poetry that's elusive and complex. We should try and make sense and use language as a communication tool. And my theory with language and poetry, my personal theory, which is quite modernist, is that poetry should use language as a means and an end in itself. So, so half the reason we write a poem, at least half the reason I write a poem, is because I have such an indelible love and fascination with language.
Yeah.
But I think without language being, if you just write language as an end in itself, then you get language poetry, which is,
Right.
L equals A equals U. No, L equals U
Yeah.
equals A.
Which
Yeah,
I
that.
find so odious.
And so utterly boring
Oh
because
God.
it hasn't got the language as means towards narrative or purpose or argument to sort of put all its invention as that skeleton to hang its invention on. So it just turns into a sort of jumble of nothingness. And the statements it makes aren't really inventive because there's no narrative or plot or sort of discursive argument that would cause sort of a flare of brilliance or sort of a flare of articulation to occur. So it just becomes sort of a dead lump of non sequiturs.
Yeah.
I
Yeah. Oh
also
yeah.
don't.
I'm,
But I
I'm,
also
I'm-
find sort of the movement's ethos as just language as communication and not an end in itself, as creating a poetry that I just find deeply, deeply uninteresting and just deeply, deeply boring, or at least deeply, in some sense, a poetry that just I find I'm just incredibly dissatisfied with. So I've sort of sit on sort of the very prickly and barbed wire fence of the poetry landscape and sort of
yeah.
hold
It's
on
funny
to
because
some
I
sort
think
of
I don't. Maybe I have been surprised by some of the comments I've heard from Brits about the movement because I mean, you're right. I certainly don't think of Larkin as being, essentially a poet of linguistic invention, but I also don't think of his poems as being totally translatable. I mean, I actually think of them
no.
as being like quite finely tuned to tone and to sound, and they're funny and
Oh, totally.
in ways that are like you can't do that with mere plotting denotation, right?
No. You can't do that. Yeah. And the million petaled flower of being here on
Yeah,
like
yeah,
the
yeah.
last lines of is it on Old Men? I can't remember the exact name of the poem, but
That's the old fools. Yeah, yeah,
Old Fools, yeah, that's it.
yeah.
The million petaled flower of being here is basically unparaphrasable, and it's
Right.
brilliant.
Yeah,
And I don't, I have a weird, yeah, I have a weird distaste for Larkin, that I can't completely rationalize.
Sure.
But yeah,
Yeah.
I do
Yeah.
think. But I think maybe it's not even Larkin's poetry in itself, but some of the things Larkin has said or made aesthetic statements that really rile me, like his
Right.
comments about do you know, have you heard his comments about the Miss Kitty? When
No, I have not. I mean, I've heard almost none of his comments outside his poems. My understanding is that he was a pretty awful person outside of his poems.
he was, yes, he probably was. As a critic, he once made a comment about, I think it was in an anthology of sort of 1950s poems, which was really a sort of hidden manifesto for the movement. And he says about the Miss Kitty that modernist poets are treating poetry as a sort of as they're sitting around a table and there's a kitty. Do you know? So a kitty in English speakers in sort of old or 20th century English
Like the
is
pot
in
when you a
Beckett.
game of
Yeah,
cards, like you something you hold in common.
yes. So he's saying that poets are sitting around a table and there's a big pot of mythology and allusion to other poets, and they're dragging stuff out and throwing it in their poems. And he says, I do not want poets to write like this. They sound like undergraduates who just want to be pleased, who want to please other people, and who just want to be like seen as clever by throwing in allusions to sort of this
Right.
popular mythos.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I don't agree with that at all. But I
No.
can say I feel like he's railing against sad poetry, but has
Right.
brought that on to everyone.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I so much of the literature I love draws heavily on myth and I mean, I also think like all of like any representation of myth you can find, no matter how far you go back, that is also dipping into the myth kitty, right there. Like it's like sourdough bread. Like there's no original form of it. It's always dipping in and reworking and re-articulating. So no, I think I'm very much with you there. My suspicion, as you said, is that there's some unspoken set of references or assumptions that he's working from that, so that he is dismissing something there that is no longer in the room when we come to those comments.
Yes.
Or that he means something that we're not looking at when we hear those comments.
Although I do think there is a slight ghost of Eliot hovering over it. I do not think. I think he has.
Oh, like he's taken a crack at Eliot as well. You think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I just ask you a quick question?
Please. Yeah.
Because I'm sure I read somewhere a few years ago an interesting article that said for American poetry and American poets, they have a much less deep sort of history of poetry to draw on. So they go, when they're taught in school, the earliest poets, American poets they get are sort of Whitman and Dickinson, and then most of the poets of the 20th century, most of the American poets of the 20th century are given to them. So I was wondering, what was your experience in school of poetry, and like what century was most of the poetry from? And
I mean, I would that we had read more Whitman and Dickinson. I read much more deeply and richly in high school. I went to a little hippie high school. I don't know if y'all have hippies there, but no, in college, I wasn't an English major. So, I mean, drama is very different from English in that apart from like taking a drama history course or two, you're not really, you're so far less are you studying what has been done before than you are studying like a practice, like how to put on a good show, basically, is most of what you end up studying.
You're studying theory and practicality without sort of personal thinking.
Whereas in English, you're mostly studying, everything that has been written and what's been written about what's been written. I was not an English major, so I did take a lot of creative writing classes, which, I mean, not only did we not read people who lived before the 19th century. Almost everybody we read was like both alive and like relatively young. I mean, we read like the books mostly of like 30 or 40 somethings. It was really unbelievably limited and really sort of disgraceful in retrospect. It's part of what like it's part of what made me very cynical about. I think it's different. Like Brian went to Columbia and they have a great books program and they're very good about trying actually at least to expose you to things that that were written quite a long time ago. But no, I mean, I think that characterization is very accurate. I would even say that most. Yeah, I mean, I think you're lucky if the well goes as deep as Whitman and Dickinson with most American poets, I would say.
Yeah. That's interesting because I think, especially in England, you probably get 3 or 4 poets from the 20th and 21st century, and then most of the poets are 19th. At GCSE, there was probably quite a few 19th century poets and a few 20th and 21st century poets. And at A level, which is slightly higher level, you'd probably go back to the metaphysicals and Marvell and Donne. So in the English education system, we have a slightly broader, diverse, sort of more historical pool of knowledge. It's interesting to hear your opinion. It's interesting to hear how you disliked, or at least how you felt slightly underdone by that by sort of the contemporaneity of the poets you got.
I mean, we read some poets who are alive and that I like and I still like, but no, I mean, it was a terrible education in poetry. I mean, again, if you were a proper English major, you got a different kind of exposure, but I think most poets, most American poets are academic poets of one type or another. Fewer and fewer of them are tenure track, but yeah, I mean, in creative writing poetry circles, the well is a fucking puddle. It's terrible. So no, I probably have unrealistically sunny expectations about British poets in contrast to American poets, but I think at least some of that is well founded.
Yeah, I think expecting a British poet to maybe name their influences and have a few poets among them who hadn't lived for a few hundred years is probably a good expectation. I personally don't feel that I have really received yet an education in poetry from any institution. I don't think my school, the English school system, does not teach poetry well. I don't know how similar it is to the American, but there is sort of a focus on analysis. I think I've taught myself poetry.
That was my conversation with Cameron Clark. You can find Cameron, I think, mostly on Erratosphere. Please do go say hi to him there. I will put a link in the show notes to something Cameron oriented or other. And I hope to get him back on the show again sometime soon. You can reach me, as always, at sleerickets@gmail.com and on Twitter @sleerickets. Please do go on Twitter and send a message to the rotating cast of Slee Ricketts characters managing that account. Thank you all for listening. With any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.